They are all gone away now from Sagamore Hill. In the autumn sunshine, the great house still commands the slope as it always did, a friendly family refuge. Yet somehow it has become unfamiliar and remote, silent as the sundial which measures time, but tells nothing of joy or sorrow. It is only in memory that I hear again the rush of children's feet upon the stairs. In memory, I see again the man, laughing and arguing, who was the center not only of our family, but of a far larger world beyond. My husband, the 26th President of the United States.
It is a season of celebration. Born in revolution, the United States has conquered a continent known the anguish of civil war. Now, in the early years of the 20th century, the young nation is a world power, proudly parading on July 4th, its birthday. A parade is clear evidence that the marchers know where they're going, usually down Main Street into the town square. There, John Philip Sousa leads the band. Politicians point with pride, and children at last get their fill of lemonade before the fireworks begin. Like any good holiday, the 4th of July in 1905 is a day off. To picnic in the park, promenade on a seaside boardwalk, or just gawk at the crowd. The really adventurous may even go into the water, provided, of course, that their bathing attire does not offend public morals. Like the rest of the nation, the President of the United States and his family celebrate freedom with firecrackers.
Good evening, everyone.
Against the sound and fury, Theodore Roosevelt is a fitting symbol of America's belief in its destiny. Of himself, he says, "I rose like a rocket." Most popular president since George Washington, Roosevelt has turned national politics into theater, challenging every citizen to play a role. He demands that America live up to its great mission in the world. With evangelical zeal and frequent platitudes, he preaches a straight and narrow path to national virtue. Keep your eyes on the stars, he says, but keep your feet on the ground. A master of communication, he is among the first to perform for an instrument which will change politics forever, the motion picture camera. Whether shaking 50 hands a minute in Washington or barnstorming across America, Roosevelt radiates the energies which captivate the country. He laughs loudly at his own jokes, plays games with the children while diplomats wait, dismays his guards with an impromptu plunge in a submarine. He has hunted buffalo and grizzly bears, captured robbers, led the Rough Riders on San Juan Hill. Already he has written more than a dozen books on history, nature, and political philosophy. One of them dictated while shaving. He believes, he says, in the strenuous life. Theodore Roosevelt is not only the President of the United States, he is the most entertaining man in America, and the people love him. He was born into a world of deceptive calm, the settled squares of New York City in 1858. As a child, he is reared in the protective shelter of a wealthy and established family of Dutch importers. His mother, Martha Bullock, is the daughter of an aristocratic Georgia family. She fills her son, T.D., with romantic stories of the Old South. His father, Theodore Sr., is a large and gentle man, a leader in charities and civic reform. A frail, sickly child, young T.D. is often swept by frightening attacks of asthma. It is his father who takes him on long drives until the breathing spasms subside. It is his father who encourages steps to strengthen his body. What nature has failed to grant him, the boy will create by an act of will. In his diary, he records the adventures of his restless mind, the growing awareness that every creature is a unique experiment in nature. Each day is a discovery, a confrontation with the infinite variety of living forms, some far better equipped than he to deal with the endless struggle for existence. At 7, he is a budding zoologist. In his teens, an amateur authority on birds. He is curious about any creature that flies, swims, or crawls. He makes drawings, collects turtles, mice, snakes, birds, insects. Eager to mount his specimens, he studies taxidermy. Throughout boyhood, carries the smell of arsenic used to cure the skins. At 18, stronger, less often ill, Roosevelt leaves boyhood behind. Closest to him are brother Elliot and sister Corinne. Edith Careau, a neighbor, is his frequent companion and secret childhood sweetheart. At Tranquility, the Roosevelt summer home, he and Edith argue and part. The next 4 years will be spent at Harvard University in the study of literature, history, and natural sciences. There, Roosevelt is a noted dandy and snob. He lives in a room off campus furnished by his older sister, Bammy. Then in his sophomore year, his father is suddenly gone, dead of cancer at 46. For Roosevelt, he will forever remain the best man I ever knew. Roosevelt strives harder. Always near the top of his class, he sometimes must be reminded that it is the professor, not he, who is conducting the lecture. He continues the physical training encouraged by his father. Now he triumphs over his frail body. Cocky and aggressive, he's quick to challenge Harvard's lightweight champion. Though unsuccessful, he is a formidable rival in the field and on the river. In typical headlong fashion, Roosevelt falls instantly and totally in love with Alice Lee, 17-year-old daughter of a wealthy Boston family. He pursues her with determination until, exhausted and overwhelmed, she agrees to marry him. They are wed in 1880. Theodore and Alice begin married life in a townhouse in New York City while preparing plans for a larger family home at Oyster Bay, Long Island. Despite upper-class prejudice against politics, Roosevelt joins a local Republican club and quickly finds himself running for office. At 23, he is elected an assemblyman from Manhattan, the youngest member of the state legislature. His political debut gains wide attention and praise, but not always from Republican bosses. With impartial reformer's zeal, Roosevelt attacks corruption in the Democrats' Tammany Hall and in his own party as well. In Albany, Roosevelt receives joyful word that his wife has given birth to a daughter. Then, suddenly, another message. Wife and mother are desperately ill. Return at once. In New York, death waits at his stricken home. There is barely time to say goodbye to his mother, who is dying of typhoid. Hours later, suffering from complications of childbirth, Alice dies in his arms. It is Valentine's Day, 1884. Roosevelt is shattered. Numbly, he will follow 2 coffins to the cemetery, give his newborn daughter to his sister's care, then flee to other solitudes. He has come to the North Dakota Badlands before. He posed in fringed buckskin for the camera, an Ivy League swell masquerading in a frontier myth. Once he came to hunt buffalo and deer. Now he has come to find a more elusive game, himself. In this twisted landscape, with its casual reminders of death or survival, he tries to endure from day to day, in simple tasks to find a path back to life. He will never speak of Alice Lee again. Black care, he says, rarely sits behind a rider whose pace is fast enough.
It was still the Wild West in those days, the west of the Indian and the buffalo hunter, the soldier and cowpuncher, the Isle of Ghosts and of strange dead memories. It was a land of vast silent spaces, of lonely rivers and of plains where the wild game stared at the passing horseman. It was a land of scattered ranches, of herds of long-horned cattle, and of the reckless riders who, unmoved, looked in the eyes of life or of death. In that land we led a free and hardy life, with horse and with rifle. We worked under the scorching midsummer sun, and we knew the freezing misery of riding night guard, and the stars were glorious in our eyes each night before we fell asleep.
Like Roosevelt himself, the West is in transition. On the banks of the Little Missouri, only a few buffalo remain. Now in the open rangeland, there are few free-running animals. Ranchmen replace them with stock in which they can burn their own brand of private ownership. For Roosevelt, the brand is the Maltese Cross. Upon this landscape, Roosevelt cuts an odd and startling figure. With his spectacles, his high-pitched voice, and broad accent, he appears every inch the Eastern tenderfoot. But when he outlasts other men in the saddle, revels in cold and rain, and disarms a threatening gunman with a single blow, his trail mates grant him an awed respect. Roosevelt, in turn, loses his snobbery and gains a broader view of human worth. Inevitably, his long seclusion must come to an end. Powerful as the summons of the wilderness may be, it is far from other arenas where ideas clash. Above him, the eagle is master of the wild terrain over which it soars. Roosevelt knows that his mastery must be learned and won in a world of men.
We knew toil and hardship and hunger and thirst, and we saw men die violent deaths as they worked among the horses and cattle or fought in evil feuds with one another. But we felt the beat of hardy life in our veins, and ours was the glory of work and the joy of living.
Welcomed back by the press, Roosevelt returns to New York, quickly enters local politics. He runs for mayor and loses. He is reunited with his daughter Alice, now learning to walk. And for the first time, he will hold his brother's daughter, Eleanor Roosevelt. Again, he encounters his boyhood sweetheart, Edith Carroll, whom he has carefully avoided since Harvard days. They begin a discreet courtship. He and Edith are quietly married in London in 1886. At last, he brings his bride to the house he had built for another. Sagamore Hill, Edith takes baby Alice as her own, and from a marriage that grows stronger year by year, 5 more children will be born in the next decade. It is a decade of other change as well. Stronghold of old and patrician families, New York has become the great port of entry for an unending stream of immigrants seeking a dream, often finding only the sweatshop. Roosevelt serves a tempestuous term as U.S. Civil Service Commissioner, then becomes head of New York City's police board. There he attacks the blatant corruption of a department where every job is for sale, and bribes from brothels and saloons equal more than 2/3 of its annual budget. In 1896, Republican presidential candidate William McKinley conducts a dignified campaign from his home in Canton, Ohio. Roosevelt barnstorms the country on McKinley's behalf in a series of fighting speeches. With the Republican victory, he is made Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Amid rising tensions between the United States and Spain, Roosevelt is a war hawk. As the USS Maine is sent to Cuba, he summons the spirit to fight. No triumph of peace, he tells the Naval War College, is quite so great as the supreme triumphs of war. Then, in Havana Harbor, the Maine blows up. Though the cause of the explosion is unknown, 262 men have died, and many Americans are quick to blame the Spanish. While a funeral procession for the victims passes through Washington, national indignation is rising. Roosevelt is determined to see the Navy prepare for war. When the Secretary goes on holiday, Assistant Secretary Roosevelt fires off an unauthorized and remarkable cable.
Dewey, Hong Kong. Order the squadron accept the monocacy to Hong Kong. Keep full of coal. In the event of declaration of war, Spain, your duty will be to see that the Spanish squadron does not leave the Asiatic coast, and then offensive operations in Philippine Islands. Keep Olympia until further orders. Roosevelt.
On April 25, 1898, the nation is at war with Spain. The Navy is prepared. Within a week comes the astounding news that in a 7-hour engagement off Manila, Admiral Dewey has destroyed Spain's Asiatic squadron without the loss of a single American life. Not to be cheated of his share of the action, Roosevelt quits his office. Compelled by deeply felt reasons of his own, perhaps some inner need to test his courage in battle, he says goodbye to friends and growing family and goes to war. He proposes a volunteer cavalry regiment of Rough Riders. Men take second in command under Leonard Wood, a close friend and veteran Indian fighter. His announcement brings an immediate response. He's overwhelmed with applications. Carefully screened, only 1 in 20 are finally chosen. Then in San Antonio, Texas, the maverick military force assembles for the weeks of arduous training. The lieutenant colonel soon arrives. Purposely, he has chosen a mixed lot, but creating a coherent unit is not easily nor quickly achieved. Amid leathery cowhands, Western mavericks, and Indians, he has scattered Ivy League tennis champions, football players, yachtsmen. They will remain loyal friends.
Dear Mr. President, this is just a line to tell you that we are in fine shape. The men are picking up the drill wonderfully. We are ready to leave now at any moment, and we earnestly hope that we will be put into Cuba with the very first troops. The sooner, the better.
Eager for action, the men cheer the orders to move out. Then, stunned, they learn that for lack of transport, no more than 2/3 of the men and only the officers' horses can be taken. Landed on the Cuban coast, the Rough Riders will have to fight on foot. They begin the long march through tropical heat and rain and sudden ambush toward the high ridges protecting the key port of Santiago. At Las Guasimas, at Bloody Ford, at Kettle Hill, the losses are heavy under the fire of cannon and Mauser rifles. Swept by sudden death, the Rough Riders do not falter through the days of battle. At last, miraculously unhurt, Roosevelt on horseback leads his men in the long charge that will be celebrated in art and legend, that will add San Juan Hill to the roster of famed American battles.
The Spaniards kept up a very heavy firing, but the regulars would not be denied. And as they climbed the ridges, the Spanish broke and fled.
As the Rough Riders pose victorious at the top of the hill, the cost has been great. Almost 1/5 of the regiment dead or wounded. But in battle, Roosevelt has perhaps one piece within himself. Returning from the 3-month war, Roosevelt is hailed as a conquering hero. Landing at Montauk, Long Island with his Rough Riders and the Regimental Eagle, he is welcomed with honors and parades. Then happily he rejoins the family he had left behind. For Theodore Roosevelt, his famed charge does not halt at the crest of San Juan Hill. It quickly carries him into the New York governor's mansion at Albany. He is a maverick governor and soon pits himself against the power brokers. In 2 years, he signs 1,000 bills into law. The time had come, he said, to show my teeth a little. Boss Thomas Platt is alarmed. He prepares a scheme to get rid of his headstrong foe, force him into harmless exile. Over Roosevelt's protests, Platt maneuvers him into running as vice presidential candidate with McKinley in the 1900 campaign. Later, gleeful at the Republican victory, Platt attends the inauguration, as he says, to see Teddy take the veil. There, shunted into the background, Roosevelt listens as McKinley is sworn into office. The crowds cheer McKinley along the route of the inaugural parade. Behind the president, Roosevelt rides alone, certain that as vice president, his political career is finished. 1901, an electric tower rises above the city of Buffalo, New York. It is the centerpiece of the Pan American Exposition and a testament of faith by a people who only yesterday mastered the raw frontier. The canals, columns, and ornate facades evoke the architecture of the past. Yet they reveal the energies of a nation with bold expectations for the future. Vice President Roosevelt speaks at the exposition.
We stand on the threshold of a new century, big with the fate of mighty nations. Glorious in youth and strength, our nation looks into the future with eager eyes and rejoices as a strong man to run a race.
America greets the new century with honorable intentions, with the wonders of its future now illuminated by Thomas Edison's new invention, the electric light. In September 1901, McKinley makes a formal visit to the exposition. He also speaks with the optimism of a new era.
My fellow citizens, this country is in a state of unexampled prosperity. The figures show that we are furnishing profitable employment to the millions of working men throughout the United States. Our capacity to produce has developed so enormously, and our products have so multiplied, that the problem of more markets requires our...
Yet even as the president speaks, the future holds a gun. It is concealed in the hand of a young anarchist. McKinley is mortally wounded. In shock and horror, the crowds wait as word is flashed across a stunned nation. For several days, the president appears to rally. Then, in the Adirondacks, Vice President Roosevelt receives an ominous summons to Buffalo. He hurries there by carriage and train as America follows the course of McKinley's final hours.
I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And thus I swear.
Theodore Roosevelt returns to Washington at 42, the youngest president of the United States, the post of which he had dreamed, which his enemies had thought to deny him, has become his by a tragic stroke of history. Summer 1902. In the wake of tragedy, the new administration begins cautiously. Even the bosses are reassured. But neither history nor Roosevelt can long stand still. He tours the country seeking public support. From train or platform, he addresses the people's hopes, begins to outline a broad program of national goals and social reforms.
The government ought not to conduct the business of this country, but it ought to regulate it so that it shall be conducted in the interests of the public. We are suffering from the tyranny of a small minority that is grabbing our coal deposits, our water power. That lies behind our monopolies and trusts. I intend to see that the rich man is held to the same accountability as the poor man. We are a new people. We are Americans. The worst thing that any man can do is to discriminate against fellow Americans because of race, speech, or religion. The government should do away with the evils of child labor. It is not only a disgrace to the community, but a reproach to the American public.
As always, the president's battles make news. Gleefully, cartoonists document his squeeze of the truss or his persuasive conversations with a railroad baron. To the growing crowds that welcome him in city after city, Roosevelt gives repeated proof that he will be one of the most dynamic leaders the country has ever seen.
Good morning, sir.
However combative he might be in public, at home he plays a gentler role as he poses for a formal family portrait.
My dear.
To Edith and the roster of 6 active children, he is a loving, endlessly indulgent husband and father. This is a new kind of first family. Close and affectionate, their activities often take precedence over affairs of state. It is not often that they can be brought together for such a formal sitting as this, all solemn and neat. To sit still is not in their nature. Rambunctious and utterly captivating, the children run at large in the White House, keeping the staff on constant alert. As one usher reports, a nervous person has no business being around the White House these days. Still, they delight the nation's reporters, who find that the family makes irresistible copy. At the center of them all is Edith, an intensely private person, yet soon in command of her public role as First Lady. Somehow, the antics of 6 children and a hyperactive husband rarely seem to disturb her calm and measured attitude. She views each of them with a cool maternal eye.
Even in the album, they seem like a handful. Headstrong Alice, grown up at 16. Theodore said he could be president or control Alice. He could not possibly do both. Young Ted is a good boy, always stands well at school. Kermit is dreamy and independent, a bit of a loner. Ethel is a handful, hides mice in her bed. Archie is our cunning little goose. Quentin is the youngest and brightest, most like his father. Curious, all action, impossible to hold back. They used the White House ballroom as a skating rink, dropped huge snowballs on the guards, rode a pony into the elevator. I remember fearing the effects of public attention. I needn't have. They all grew up to be very much themselves.
Amid formal garden parties and bouts with Congress, the president himself leads a strenuous life. He organizes jaunts in Rock Creek Park, practices jiu-jitsu, swims in the river on wintry nights. He sets an example of physical fitness by riding 100 miles in a single day. He travels west, poses amid the giant redwoods. With forester Gifford Pinchot, he begins a crusade against destruction of the environment, against the systematic looting of public lands by private interests.
The civilized people of today look back with horror at their medieval ancestors who wantonly destroyed great works of art or sat by while they were destroyed. We have passed that stage. Yet, here in the United States, we turn our rivers and streams into sewers and dumping grounds. We pollute the air. We destroy forests and exterminate fishes, birds, and mammals, not to speak of vulgarizing landscapes with hideous advertisements. But at last, it looks as if our people were awakening.
Against powerful opposition, Roosevelt sets aside a priceless bequest for later Americans. It will be the greatest achievement of his presidency. 150 million acres of timberland as national forests. 23 national parks and monuments, including the Grand Canyon, Devil's Tower, Petrified Forest. 55 federal bird and wildlife sanctuaries. In all, 230 million acres of public lands protected for the future.
There can be no greater issue than that of conservation. Just as we must conserve our men, women, and children, we must conserve the resources of the land. We must conserve the soil, the forests. We must ensure the great national resources for the people as a whole. We aren't building this country for a day. It is to last through the ages.
Sagamore Hill held its own reminders of the wilderness. There were heads and horns everywhere, even on the roof. I never really cared much for the heads and skins that Theodore brought home, but I knew they meant a great deal to him. I do think the life he led here was the happiest, most necessary of all. He loved to spend time with the children, to live out the joyous romps his own childhood had denied him. I remember especially the point-to-point races he led across the woods and hills of Oyster Bay. One could go over, under, or through an obstacle, but never around. As one of our friends once remarked, you must always remember that the president is about 6.
Through the reeds, they saw a figure, a strange white face, rowing along through the reeds at midnight. It was rowing along through the reeds in a coffin. Well, you can
He especially enjoyed telling tall tales to the children. At campouts, there would be lots of gritty food. Then, to Quentin's utter delight, he would scare them half to death with ghost stories.
To dig a hole. Watched with horror mounting in their hearts and realized that he was digging a hole to bury the coffin in. Finally, when he got down below the reeds in the hole and they heard the sound of the coffin being lowered, they couldn't see him any longer, and they watched, and they got very, very frightened. They decided to gather up their gear, and they were packing up, trying to get away. And all of a sudden, Conklin looked around out through the window and he said, "Gildersleeve, what was that?" Gildersleeve looked out the window and saw coming toward them the man with the white face walking on top of
the reeds. His white hands extended toward...
Roosevelt himself is becoming a legend, a character in national folklore, much like Paul Bunyan or Davy Crockett. Around his adventures, people are creating myths. When on a hunt he refuses to shoot a captive bear, the story sweeps the country. The teddy bear is born. Soon it is celebrated in games, toys, and picture books. Roosevelt even becomes the subject of an early Edison motion picture. In it, he is shown as the hero of a modernized version of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Distrusted by liberals, feared by conservatives, he remains the most popular and fascinating figure in America. His image adorns dishes, calendars, and song sheets celebrating his exploits. His name is used to sell groceries, patriotism, self-improvement programs, crusades against sin. He is idealized as the best of America. And criticized as the worst. Roosevelt is aware that his policies have been controversial. As the 1904 election draws near, he privately fears defeat. Instead, he is elected by the greatest popular majority that had ever been given. At last, Roosevelt is president in his own right. Elated by his victory, he tells his wife, "I'm no longer a political accident." Before the vast crowd assembled in front of the Capitol for his inauguration, he reaffirms the principles which have been central to his campaign.
I stand for fair play, and I stand for a square deal. Ours is a government of liberty. No man is above it, no man is below it. We must treat each man on his worth and merits as a man. Each is entitled to no more and should receive no less.
Roosevelt has an all-American parade. Down Pennsylvania Avenue march bands and dignitaries, farmers, workers, ordinary citizens of every kind, even war-painted Indians, led by Chief Geronimo. It is foreign affairs, America's relations with the uneasy world beyond her borders, that will increasingly demand Roosevelt's concern. His first move is an act of peace. Russia and Japan had been at war for almost 2 years. Now both nations welcome the president's call for a peace conference in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. With quiet, skillful mediation, Roosevelt reconciles the claims of the two adversaries. In 3 weeks, helps hammer out an agreement. It is a triumph for which he will win the Nobel Peace Prize. With the delegates still at work, he slips away on an irresistible adventure. He has ordered the Navy's prototype submarine Plunger to Long Island Sound. Eluding the Secret Service and with gale winds blowing, he takes an hour-long dive beneath the surface. Aghast, one newspaper calls him our submerged president. In Panama, these long deserted railroad tracks lead only to oblivion. reminders of the failed French attempt to build a canal linking the Atlantic and Pacific. Roosevelt is determined to drive the canal through. In 1906, he comes to Panama, the first president to journey outside the United States while in office. There he is welcomed on the cathedral steps by the president of the tiny new republic. It is the culmination of his most audacious political act. Frustrated in his earlier attempts to negotiate rights across the isthmus, Roosevelt has intervened in the Panamanian Revolution for independence from Colombia. He has recognized the new nation of Panama less than 90 minutes after its successful coup and secured rights for a canal zone on favorable terms to the United States. Now, surveying the task he has undertaken, he poses on one of the giant machines that will do the job. In tropical heat and rain, as many as 45,000 workmen will labor for 10 years to build the 40-mile waterway. It is the most massive construction effort ever undertaken on Earth. Using a vast array of shovels and dredges, they will blast a path through the jungle and mountains, build the huge locks that will lift great ships 85 feet above sea level. All of this is made possible by the defeat of the mosquito, the deadly carrier of yellow fever and malaria.
If I had followed traditional methods, I should have submitted a dignified state paper of probably 200 pages to the Congress, and the debate would have been going on yet. But I took the canal zone and let Congress debate. And while the debate goes on, the canal does also.
Rowing in a quiet inlet in Oyster Bay, Roosevelt's imagination roams wider waters. Completion of the canal is years away, yet he is intent on extending American influence and power. For that, he believes the nation should speak softly, but carry a big stick. In the early 20th century, the big stick is the battle fleet's 12-inch guns. In the Civil War, the ironclad was supreme. By 1907, it is only a quaint relic amid the guest warships invited to a naval exposition off Jamestown, Virginia. Here, before the representatives of 37 foreign powers, Roosevelt pointedly reaffirms that America has come of age. Later, he will prepare a more spectacular demonstration of American power. He will send the fleet on an extended training exercise around the world. Part of its mission is to impress Japan, reduce tensions which have been growing in the Far East. Unspoken is Roosevelt's hope that the voyage will sway Congress to give him another battleship or two. In December 1907, he reviews the fleet of 16 battleships as they steam away on their historic journey. Symbolic of their peaceful intent, all have been painted white. At home and abroad, the Navy's voyage will be variously interpreted. Some see it as a demonstration of strength and goodwill. Others believe it a naked expression of gunboat diplomacy. Roosevelt cannot restrain his enthusiasm.
Did you ever see such a fleet or such a day? By George, isn't it magnificent?
Steaming past the tip of South America, the Great White Fleet enters the Pacific. Traveling 45,000 miles in its 14-month voyage, the cruise is a brilliant maritime achievement. The Navy has given convincing proof that the United States is now a two-ocean power. Roosevelt has vowed not to seek a third term. In March 1909, he turns over the presidency to his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, confident that Taft will follow the progressive policies he has launched. Yet, regardless of his pretenses, Roosevelt is bleak. At 50, he has already served 2 terms as president. Now, still in full possession of all his abilities, he feels abruptly excused from life. As always, he finds release in action. 3 weeks after leaving the presidency, he's off to Africa with his son Kermit for a year-long safari, to know, as he says, the joy of hunting the mighty and terrible lords of the wilderness, the cunning, the wary, and the grim. Privately, his old adversary, J.P. Morgan, hopes that when Roosevelt encounters his first lion, the lion will do its duty. Bearing a collection of big game guns and a portable library that includes Homer, Mark Twain, and James Fenimore Cooper, the Roosevelt caravan strikes off into the bush. Backed by the Smithsonian Institution, he will collect specimens with a team of naturalists who are constantly amazed by his wide knowledge of birds and animals. Tribal chieftains are no less impressed by the Bwanamakuba, or great master from beyond the seas. They greet him with a dance of warriors. Attended by the press, who observe and report every move he makes, Roosevelt seems tireless, hunting by day, writing voluminous articles and letters by night. The party will send back to the Smithsonian a prodigious array of 13,000 plant and animal specimens. With a strange bloodlust for one so devoted to nature, Roosevelt himself shoots no fewer than 296 major specimens. Among them, one rhinoceros stopped at 13 paces. Returning to the wider world, he travels down the Nile. Now bronzed and fit after his long months in the bush. At Khartoum, he views the world from the lofty perch of a camel's back. Then, meeting Edith, they head for Europe, begin a round of formal state calls. Cartoonists satirize this coming of the vigorous American to the aging rulers of Europe. France, 1910. Roosevelt exchanges pith helmet for top hat and formal diplomatic wear. Yet he is uncomfortable amid the plumed royalty of the continent, who compete for his attendance at their courts. Most of the monarchs he meets do not impress him. He is more interested in the lectures he will give at Oxford and the Sorbonne. Wherever he travels, he can sense the growing tensions. He's invited to review the country's troops, to see how France might defend herself in a conflict. The Lancers from the Paris garrison are impressive, but would provide little defense in a more modern age of warfare. In Norway, addressing the Nobel Prize Committee, Roosevelt speaks out for disarmament and makes a startling new proposal.
It would be a masterstroke if those great powers honestly bent on peace would form a League of Peace, not only to keep peace among themselves, but to prevent, by force if necessary, its being broken by others.
Berlin. The arrogant Kaiser Wilhelm admires Roosevelt, but the feeling is not shared. I had hoped to find myself mistaken about him, he says of the Kaiser, but I found his point of view very sordid. A somber errand brings him to London. There, the funeral of England's King Edward VII marks more than the death of a monarch. It is one of the last rituals in an era of stately ordered certainties, soon to die on the battlefields of Europe. Together for the last time, the kings of Europe jostle for rank in the procession. Roosevelt walks behind the others as an ordinary American citizen. Weary of royal egos, he is happy to leave. If I ever meet another king, he growls, I think I shall bite him. At last, after 15 months in Africa and Europe, Roosevelt comes home. He is staggered by the welcome that awaits him. While still in the harbor, he is besieged by reporters, surrounded by friends and family. Among them is his niece Eleanor and her husband, distant relative Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Ashore, 2,500 dignitaries and politicians stand by to greet him, some bearing tales of growing strife in the Republican Party. But today, all eyes are on Teddy.
I have been away a year and a quarter from America, and I have seen strange and interesting things alike in the heart of the frowning wilderness and in the capitals of the mightiest and most highly polished civilized nations. I have thoroughly enjoyed myself, And now I am more glad than I can say to get home, to be back in my own country, back among the people I love. And I am ready and eager to do my part as far as I am able.
Attended by an escort of Rough Riders, Roosevelt rides up Broadway and Fifth Avenue amid the cheering crowds. For the returned traveler, the spontaneous outpouring of American affection is like a deep breath of life. For Roosevelt, life means risk, the breaking of new trails, even if they lead into thin air. Since the earliest flights of the Wright brothers, he has been fascinated by aircraft. Now, in the summer of 1910, he visits St. Louis on a speaking tour for Republicans in the midterm elections. At a Wright brothers exhibition, he watches the flight of an early biplane, little more than wings and an open frame. When invited on a test flight himself, Roosevelt does not hesitate. Wearing only business suit and goggles, he is soon strapped into the aircraft beside pilot Arch Hoxsey. Minutes later, a delighted Roosevelt is in the air.
Bully! Bully! This is bully! Yes? Yes, Davis. What?
There are greater risks on the ground. Under Taft, the conservative old guard has regained control of the Republican Party and is now steadily dismantling the progressive reforms won under Roosevelt's presidency. Furious, Roosevelt leads the progressives into battle. Breaking his old friendship with Taft, he demands that the government be freed from the sinister control of special interests. He attacks those who hold human rights secondary to profits. He calls for women's suffrage, new income taxes, better labor conditions, aid to farmers, stronger conservation measures. To the conservatives who support Big Bill Taft, such demands are little different from the doctrines preached by Karl Marx. Though Roosevelt wins the primaries, he is denied the Republican presidential nomination in Chicago in 1912. In a bitter delegate dispute, he claims he has been defrauded and bolts the convention with his supporters. Weeks later, in the same convention hall, Roosevelt becomes the presidential candidate for the Progressives, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. He launches his campaign with a fighting speech which rallies his followers and alarms the conservatives, who declare it a manifesto of revolution. With high hopes, the progressives meet at Sagamore Hill. But realists foresee a grim climax to one of the most bitter campaigns in American history. With the Republicans now split between two factions and two candidates, Taft or Roosevelt, one observer remarks, the only question now is which corpse gets the most flowers. Against them stands the Democratic Party candidate, New Jersey Governor Woodrow Wilson. A professor turned politician, he too believes in progressive domestic reforms, but strict neutrality in the rising tensions abroad. Severe and scholarly, he seems little fitted for political battle. For Roosevelt, battle is his natural element. He plunges into an arduous national campaign. Yet this time he is fighting not only an eloquent Democratic adversary, but his own former political allies. Outraged by his defection, the Republican press attacks the former president, portraying him as a dangerous egomaniac, a revolutionary, at worst, demonstrably insane. Then in Milwaukee, he is struck by a fanatic's bullet. Saved by a copy of a speech in his pocket and by his own muscular physique, Roosevelt seizes the moment of high drama. He insists on making his 90-minute speech before accepting treatment.
I'll do the best I can, but there is a bullet in my body. I am in this cause with my whole heart and soul. I believe that the progressive movement is for making life a little easier for all our people.
Roosevelt recovers, though the bullet remains permanently lodged in his chest. But his performance does not save the campaign. As predicted, Wilson wins a resounding victory, with Roosevelt second and Taft a poor third. Woodrow Wilson is sworn in, and the inaugural festivities begin. Alone, Roosevelt contemplates the collapse of his career. Most of his reforms will eventually become law, but he will finally urge his followers to return to the Republican Party. The fight is over, he says. There are no loaves and fishes. At 55, again restless, Roosevelt goes journeying, this time to South America. He has planned a series of lectures and a scientific expedition of his own, but is delighted when the Brazilian government suggests the exploration of a great unmapped river far in the vastness of the jungle. Known as the River of Doubt, it is believed a tributary of the Amazon. Roosevelt accepts instantly. I had to go, he says later. It was my last chance to be a boy. Again with his son Kermit, and accompanied by Brazilian explorer Colonel Rondon, Roosevelt and a small party head into the interior. For long days, they move up the crocodile-infested Paraguay. Then, leaving the boats, they strike overland by horse before they at last reach the headwaters of the river they are to explore.
On February 27th, 1914, shortly after midday, we started down the River of Doubt into the unknown. It was the height of the rainy season, and the swollen torrent was swift and brown.
It is a grimly demanding adventure. For more than 6 weeks, the explorers moved downstream through an endless succession of rapids and portages. Five canoes are shattered and must be rebuilt. Food runs short. In their perilous passage, one man is drowned and Kermit is nearly lost. Another man goes berserk and kills a companion, then disappears into the wilderness. Already stricken by jungle fever, Roosevelt injures his leg in a canoe accident. Unable to walk, he must be carried. At last, infected and suffering a temperature of 105 degrees, he can go no further. Lying in a tent in feverish delirium, he recites fragments of poetry. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree. The burden of leadership falls to Kermit. Despite his father's request to be left behind, Kermit and the others bring Roosevelt to safety. He emerges from the wilderness 50 pounds lighter, weakened by disease, and barely able to stand. But the mission is completed. They have mapped the 1,000-mile river of doubt, now named in his honor, Rio Teodoro. In Europe, the German Kaiser's armies march into Belgium in the sudden opening moves of the First World War. Within days, other nations mobilize. The big guns are arrayed along battle lines that stretch from the English Channel to the Black Sea, from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. The long nightmare has begun. In the beginning, like most Americans, Roosevelt supports Wilson's neutrality. Yet as Germany's attack broadens and its U-boat campaign becomes more ruthless, he calls on Wilson to take sharper measures against Germany, demands that the nation prepare for the conflict he feels is inevitable. He attacks an administration that exalts peace above righteousness, that substitutes high-sounding words for action. Yet for all his personal popularity, Roosevelt remains an isolated figure without real power. A leader without office, he turns briefly to an older constituency. Among the royal terns at Pelican Island, a bird sanctuary he established off the Louisiana coast, he seeks again the winged companions of his childhood. Now events set a pace of their own. At sea, German U-boats widen their attack, sink not only warships, but any vessel supplying the Allies. In early 1917, barely 3 months after Wilson's re-election, Germany rejects United States claims of neutral rights, sinks 6 American merchant ships in quick succession. Across the nation, there is a rising tide of anger and outrage. Amid increasing demonstrations and cries for action, Wilson finally asks Congress for a declaration of hostilities against Germany. On April the 6th, 1917, the nation is at war. Now the preparations which Roosevelt has been demanding for 2 years at last begin. Its energies released, the nation makes a surging effort. In months to come, America will send a growing stream of men and weapons to the battlefronts of armies stalemated by exhaustion. Roosevelt's 4 sons become part of the national effort. Leading troops in France, Theodore Jr. is wounded and wins the Croix de Guerre. Kermit receives the British Military Cross. Quentin, the youngest at 20, becomes a fighter pilot, member of a squadron flying the light biplanes, which almost daily engage the enemy high above the trenches. But Roosevelt himself wears no uniform. At 59, he is far from the sound of guns. Yet, reviewing troops soon to be sent abroad, he feels again the mounting urge that 19 years ago swept him to the top of San Juan Hill. Despite his bitter attacks on Wilson, Roosevelt visits the president, asks that he be allowed to lead a volunteer division against the Germans. Though charmed by his visitor, Wilson will refuse to permit his aging, headstrong opponent to lead a romantic charge into the carnage of modern warfare.
As far as I am concerned, this is a very exclusive war.
While his sons fight the battle of the guns, Roosevelt himself must wage a war of words. Tirelessly, he travels the country, attacking Wilson's failure to prepare, spurring the nation to swifter action. He sells war bonds, supports the Red Cross. But a new and strident note of intolerance dismays many of his former friends and supporters. Always a proponent of total undivided Americanism, he now demands loyalty oaths, sows distrust of German Americans, condemns conscientious objectors. Eagerly, he welcomes visiting units of newly trained soldiers, soon to depart for Europe. To them, he praises the virtues of a righteous war, extols the ancient warrior disciplines of duty and honor. Unmentioned is the toll already exacted, the price tabulated in the straight geometric rows of the dead, in messages that begin, "We regret to inform you." Then to Sagamore Hill there also comes such a message.
Die with the summertime, and our paths may be far apart, but there's one rose that dies not in Picardy. 'Tis the rose that I keep in my heart.
For Theodore Roosevelt, it is a long, lonely walk back to the house to tell Edith.
To feel that one has inspired a boy to conduct that has resulted in his death has a pretty serious sign for a father.
But there's one rose that dies not in Picardy. 'Tis the rose I keep in my heart.
Shrouded in silence, Sagamore Hill displays a flag for its 4 sons, while the stricken Roosevelt wears the armband of death. It is not only Quentin who is gone. A friend says, at last the boy in him had died. Yet he continues. Often desperately weary, he lashes out with his old fire at faint hearts and war profiteers alike, rages against a world that does not always oblige his tablet of clear and simple virtues. For many Americans, he again seems to be the conscience of the nation. Almost certainly, he will be named the Republican presidential candidate in 1920. As the crowds grow, his pleasures narrow. His greatest private delight comes in the hours spent holding and carrying a growing number of grandchildren. In them, he recognizes his own circular journey. In the face of a child, he sees his own. Now the injuries and fevers of the past strike again. Roosevelt goes to a hospital. He is told he may spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Defiant, he insists on going home. Only 60, he has led a dozen lives, suffered blows that would have killed other men. Now weary and full of wounds, he comes back at last to the great house he has loved more than any place on earth. January 1919. To the church in Oyster Bay come townspeople and dignitaries, the friends and foes of 100 political battles. One speaks for all when he says, "You had to hate the colonel a whole lot to keep from loving him." Death, it was said, had to take him sleeping, or there would have been a fight. Soon the soldiers are back from France, proudly parading under New York's triumphal arches. They are confident they have won the war to end war, but peace will be harder. To coming generations, the future will bring still unimagined dangers, conflicts no longer easily answered by provincial loyalties. The earth itself had become a village. In great leaders, we read our hope. At Sagamore Hill, a chair is empty now, but Roosevelt's voice still echoes across the years, still summons the best of what we are. Impatient with cynics, he spoke for a young nation, reminded us of great ends we had to serve, the promises we made in our beginnings. In his faith, we reaffirmed our own. In his burning energies, we also took fire. Because he was larger than life, we too grew tall.